Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. It's the end of August. I hope you've had a great summer so far. Late last spring, I made the leap and went out and bought a drone. And I've had several questions on my channel. People have asked me, which drone am I using? How do I like it? Now I have to admit, I was real hesitant at first to buy a drone. I've really loved watching YouTube channels where they have drone shots, and I've been envious of the kind of cinematic sequences you can get with a drone. But I was really nervous because first, they're expensive. Second, it's just one more piece of kit you got to carry with you. And third, I had never flown one before. I didn't want to spend a whole bunch of money and end up having that go down the drain because of my inexperience. But I finally got over my fears and I went ahead and I bought the drone. And what I ended up buying was DJI's Mini 3 Pro. And it's a great little drone. I only had really a couple criteria when I was looking for drones. One of the most important things for me was that it was small enough that I could easily pack it and take it into the field for skiing and biking. Another consideration I really had was I wanted it to be fairly quiet. I didn't want a super drone. I've been out in the woods. I've heard people flying really noisy drones, and I was hoping that I could get a drone. Now I know all drones make noise. You can't get away from that. But if I could get one that was reasonably quiet, that was part of my goal. I also wanted to be certain that I'd be able to use this drone in the wintertime. And as you know, electronics and cold weather just don't necessarily go together. And I haven't had the best of luck with a lot of the cameras I've had over the years using them in the cold. But fortunately, there's a fellow up in Alaska. His name is Jake Sloan. He has a YouTube channel. He flies a lot of drones around. I picked up a lot of really good advice from him. And I'll put a link to his channel down below. And he's flown this particular drone in pretty cold weather, and so I was pretty confident that this was a good match for me. The other obviously thing, if you have a YouTube channel, I mean, you got to have good video quality. There's no sense even buying a drone if you're not going to get decent quality that you can use on your channel. Well, I looked at the options that were out there, but what I ended up settling on was the Mini 3 Pro from DJI, and it's a great little drone. And one of its nicest attributes is how well it collapses down. You can just see how small this drone is in comparison to my hand, and it fits real nicely in a case. Doesn't take up a whole lot of space, and I can throw this in my pack. I can take it on my bike, and the drone is pretty well protected. Now I chose the RC1 over the standard controller because the RC1 has the built-in display. It's self-contained. You can pull it out, you can turn it on, and you're pretty much ready to go. The standard controller uses your cell phone for display and control, and it takes a little bit more time. You got to attach the cell phone to the controller. You got to hook up a cable. It's just a little more cumbersome than this particular option. I also have a case for this. So this is basically what I have to throw into my pack when I take it skiing. It's bulky, but it's not horrible. Now this drone comes in at 249 grams, and it falls just under the limit for where you need a license here in the United States. Now there certainly are restrictions about flying drones, and those varies from country to country and location to location. You just have to be aware that there's some places where you literally are prohibited from flying a drone. In most places there's altitude restrictions, and there's some places they have laws about voyeurism and photographing people and flying above people in crowds. And here in the United States, as a general rule, if you keep it out of restricted areas, if you keep it lower than 400 feet, if you don't fly it over populated areas or areas where if it falls out of the sky it could injure somebody down below, and if you keep it away from people's backyards and windows and you stay away from the voyeurism problem, then you're pretty safe in flying these drones. Now where I live, there's a lot of open land. There's farmers' fields, there's national forests, there's also government public lands, and there's no airports that are nearby. I really enjoy shooting video and photos of the areas that I've known so well from a different perspective, and it's just kind of opened up my eyes to see things that I haven't really noticed before in this area. I've had a chance to look at some areas I've never been. I've looked at ski slopes that I've skied many times. I've looked at some new slopes I'd like to ski. It's really been a useful tool. This drone was actually pretty easy to learn to fly for a newbie like me. I watched a lot of videos before I took it off, and I started out real carefully and gently, And it didn't take me too long before I felt real comfortable with flying this drone. Now, every time you start the drone up and you wait a minute or two, it establishes the location of the drone via GPS. It also sets the location of this controller. And so at all times, the location of where you are and where the drone is known by the programming. And hopefully, once the drone has flown away, it'll always be able to return back to its home location, or you'll be able to fly it back to where you are. Now this drone has obstacle avoidance in basically 3 directions: forward, to the bottom, and to the back. It doesn't have obstacle avoidance to the side, so if you're flying it sideways like this, you could easily clip a tree and crash it. So far, the obstacle avoidance has worked really well for me. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't had a couple close calls. One of my biggest fears is what they call a runaway drone, where you lose communication with your drone. And there could be several reasons for that. It could be that you fly your drone beyond the limits of how far the radio signal will be. You might drop down below a hill or behind a shadow or behind a tree or something, and it cuts out the signal, and you might lose control of the drone. So if you lose connection with the controller, the drone will take a few minutes to see if it'll establish itself. It'll try to reposition itself, hopefully to get a better signal, and after a while, if it doesn't, and then it'll return to what's called the home position. I've tested that out several times, and it works very well. Now, in a situation that I intend to use this, where I'm going to have the drone follow me down the hill when I'm skiing or when I'm biking, you also have to have the ability to have the drone come to you, and because last thing you want to do is be 1,000 feet above the mountain. That's your starting location. You ski down to the mountain and then have the drone return back to the top of the mountain. You don't want to climb back up there to have to retrieve it. So you can reset that home location based upon where you're currently at. You can also fly the drone using a map that's built in here to your current location. And I've tried all of that, and it works really well. I've had a couple close calls with this drone. The first one happened, I had really built my confidence up. I thought I could handle anything. And I was on the mountain behind me up here on a ridge, and I was taking the drone up a little ways. I wanted to get a really good 360-degree photo, one that I could use to analyze some skiing runs. And lo and behold, after I shot the 360 photo, I tried to get it to return to home. The home was where I was currently standing, and it gave me an error message, said it couldn't locate home. Now, when it told me it couldn't return to home from some known error, I began to panic. And I knew that I was going to have to try to fly it back manually. And I could just barely hear it, but I couldn't see it. I knew what direction it was. And so I had to try and maneuver it around and fly it back towards me. I don't really know what happened. These things are basically small computers. And like all things, sometimes computers hang. Sometimes they just plain mess up. And there's been several instances on YouTube where people have what they call drone flyaways, where they just, for some reason or other, the drone doesn't behave like they should, and they lose their drone. I thought for sure that was going to be the situation that I had here. The joysticks were still working, and I was able to fly it back towards me, but I wasn't 100% certain I could land it very effectively where I was. So I flew it around a little bit. I found a good location where I could land it. I brought it down, and I grabbed it with my hands, and I went, whew, man, I dodged a bullet that time. Now that's the only time that's happened, and I've flown this thing over 300 kilometers so far. So hopefully the one glitch that I've had, I've gotten that out of the way. And I really don't know exactly what happened. All I know is that it was a pretty frantic 5 minutes while I tried to get the drone back and get it back to where I could recover it. Now, in theory, of course, if the drone can't come back to you, it'll come down and it'll find a place and it'll land, and that GPS location will be recorded on your controller, and with any luck, you'll be able to use what's called the Find the Drone function on this controller, and you'll be able to find it. I can't even imagine trying to find that drone in the trees. And I was also very nervous that because there was something wrong with this GPS function, it couldn't return to home, and that tells me for some reason or another it didn't know where it was at. Even though I had control with it, so I still had radio communication with it, it just wasn't sure where it was at. It couldn't show me on the map on the controller where it was at, but I was able to fly it using the camera and using sound and get it back to me. One of the reasons I bought this particular drone is it has some really smart features, and you can ski down the hill or you can ride your bike and the drone will follow you. Now, I haven't tested it to the limits, but I've certainly tried to walk through some brush. I've walked through trees. I've had the drone follow me, and it seems to do a pretty good job. While I'm not 100% certain that it'll always work, I have enough confidence that I'm willing to risk the drone to take some of those shots this winter. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now, one of the things I wanted to be able to do when I bought this drone was to be able to take it off and fly it up and take a look at the mountains behind me, check out the snow conditions. The peak back behind me is at 10,000 feet. And even though this has a maximum service ceiling of 13,000 feet, you can't do that. The drone is restricted. They limit how high you can fly the drone based upon the elevation that you took off from. And as I mentioned earlier, in the United States, the restriction is you're supposed to keep the drone under 400 feet above the ground. Well, you know, if I take off here and I fly it up to 400 feet and I head that direction, it doesn't take too long before, you know, that 400 feet gets gobbled up. Luckily, DJI allows you to fly it higher than that 400 feet. And I can get it up to about 1,600 feet above the takeoff elevation before it stops me and won't let me go any higher. And you just have to be quite careful when you're flying at those higher elevations that you only are 400 feet above the ground so you don't violate any rules. So as I fly it back this direction and I get close to those hills, I can slowly raise it up in its altitude. And it's still low enough it's not going to interfere with any aircraft. But when I reach that 1,600 feet above the takeoff elevation, then that's as high as I can go. Now, in theory, if I started it from 9,000 feet, you know, I could take it all the way up to 10,000, you know, as long as I was following the contour of the land legally. Now, DJI says the operating temperature ranges from 14 degrees Fahrenheit to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 10 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius. That's a pretty good range. There's most of the time when I'm going to be skiing, I'll probably be, you know, in that 10 to 20 degree range. So the drone should do just fine. Now, one of the critical things with this is how long can you fly it, given the batteries that you have. They say the flight time is anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes, depending upon the battery. I try not to push it. It's been my experience that so far the drone itself keeps really good track of how long it's been flying and how much battery is remaining and how much battery it's going to take to get back. I'd much rather fly it back and pop in another battery and fly it again than I would push the limit. I did have one instance, though, where I sort of miscalculated, and it was in the evening, and I launched it up. I wanted to get some of the colors and the clouds, and I took it a little ways away from the house, and I was flying around, and I was trying to do a time lapse, and so it was hovering for quite a bit of time, and I was watching the battery, and it was starting to get close to the time frame when I needed to come back. So I turned the drone around, and I started to fly it back. Well, in the meantime, a little thunder cell off in the distance had kicked the wind up, and it had quite a bit of headwind. Now, it normally flies back at about 20 to 22 miles per hour, and I noticed that as it was trying to return to home, it was only able to make about 5 miles per hour over ground, and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, it's going to run out of battery before it gets here. And I thought, well, I'll just have to land it in the field and then go retrieve it by hand. Well, luckily, the wind kind of reduced a bit, and it was able to make it back, and I had plenty of battery, but it's just a reminder that you always have to keep in mind what direction the wind's blowing and where your drone is in relationship to the wind. You know, obviously it's going to take a lot more battery to come back against the wind and much less battery to fly with the wind. That only makes sense. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention, and you experienced drone pilots will probably laugh at this because of my newbie experience. I see lots of videos where people have the drone following them and they're skiing or biking or whatever. What I didn't anticipate is, what do you do with the controller while the drone is flying and you're skiing or you're biking? You can't just throw the controller in the pack because the touch screen is still active, the joysticks are still active, all the buttons are active, and if it bounces around and touches any of those things, then you might be in real trouble. The drone may go off course, it may not follow you, the recording may stop. Who knows what will happen with some errant touches or buttons or whatever. And you can't just turn the controller off, because if you turn the controller off, then the drone will automatically, if it loses contact with the controller, it'll automatically return to home. Now, I really wish that DJI had a switch on the side here that would just deactivate all the buttons. and leave the controller on, and you could just easily deactivate everything on it. Then you could just throw it in your pack, and then when you get down, you could turn the switch back on, and then all the control buttons and everything would be functional. Now, I understand why they don't do that, because they want a drone pilot to be in control at all times. But when you're by yourself, it makes it really difficult to have the drone follow you while you're skiing or biking. What I ended up doing is I ended up buying this cover. What you're seeing right here is an accessory, and you essentially can put this down over the top of it, and the controller is still on. What it basically does is it prohibits the touch screen from working, and it covers the joysticks. Now, of course, the buttons are still exposed, and so you got to be real careful when you put it in your pack. My biggest hope is I'll be able to slide it in my skin pockets on my parka and be able to fly it that way. Only time will tell. Well, that's about it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, be sure to give me a thumbs up. Stay tuned for my channel for more videos. And I really look forward to using this drone this winter. Hopefully we'll get some really good skiing video. Until next time, be safe, be kind, and I hope to see you out on the trail.